Buenos días, buenas tardes a todos. Bienvenidos al diálogo virtual sobre la prevención del extremismo violento. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos el día de hoy. Mi nombre es Andrea Rodríguez, yo soy oficial de programa del Comité Interamericano contra el Terrorismo, CICTE, de la Organización de los Estados Americanos. Antes de iniciar, quiero comentarles que tenemos disponible interpretación simultánea del español al inglés y viceversa. Y en la pantalla podrán en unos momentos ver dónde ubicar el icono de interpretación. Allí van a poder escoger el idioma de su preferencia y recomendamos silenciar el audio original de esta manera para que puedan escuchar con claridad. Bien, la dinámica del día de hoy, en primer lugar, vamos a escuchar discursos de bienvenida por parte de nuestras autoridades. Posteriormente presentaré a las moderadoras de los dos paneles que vamos a tener el día de hoy. Y al final de cada uno vamos a poder realizar preguntas a los panelistas. Los participantes, ustedes pueden escuchar y hacer preguntas únicamente a través de la opción de preguntas o de Q&A. Y por favor les pedimos que sean lo más concretas y específicas posible y que se atengan a los temas que vamos a tratar el día de hoy. Les recordamos que este webinar va a quedar grabado y estará disponible por las redes sociales de CICTE. Y asimismo estamos transmitiendo ya en vivo por el Facebook de OEA CICTE. Sin más preámbulo, quiero presentar a la embajadora Elena Baños. Ella es representante de México ante la Organización de los Estados Americanos. Embajadora, muy buenos días, adelante.
Muy buenos días. Es un gusto compartir con ustedes este espacio virtual sobre la prevención y el combate al fenómeno del extremismo violento que conduce al terrorismo. Este fenómeno no es propio de una nacionalidad, orientación política ni credo. No es un fenómeno nuevo ni lejano. Todos somos vulnerables a su impacto y tenemos que actuar con mayor decisión para prevenir que estos dolorosos sucesos se repitan. Ante sus consecuencias es necesario que reflexionemos sobre su prevención y combate desde la perspectiva del multilateralismo. En este sentido, el importante, pero aún insuficiente, compendio de convenciones disponibles a nivel interamericano representan un parámetro de obligaciones para definir las acciones de nuestros países frente al extremismo violento. Me refiero a la Convención Interamericana contra el Terrorismo, la Convención Interamericana para prevenir y sancionar la tortura, la Convención Interamericana contra toda forma de discriminación e intolerancia y la Convención Interamericana contra el racismo, la discriminación racial y formas conexas de intolerancia. A estas hay que sumar, con una perspectiva de derechos humanos, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y la Convención de Belém do Pará, que definen la obligación del Estado para proteger a sus poblaciones y para ofrecer garantías mínimas con enfoques diferenciados e interseccionales en sus sistemas de justicia que sirvan para prevenir y paliar los efectos del extremismo. Adicionalmente, la declaración fortaleciendo esfuerzos hemisféricos para abordar y contrarrestar el extremismo violento que conduce al terrorismo, adoptada por la Asamblea General de la OEA en 2018, sentó las bases para un abordaje puntual alrededor de este fenómeno. Estoy segura que este primer encuentro será provechoso y que nos habremos de reunir nuevamente para continuar generando conciencia de la necesidad de discutir y combatir este fenómeno. Junto a Alison Treppel, secretaria ejecutiva del Comité Interamericano contra el Terrorismo CICTE, charlaremos hoy con 4 distinguidos expertos a quienes agradezco que hayan aceptado esta invitación. Qué mejor que iniciar este encuentro escuchando los mensajes de la Secretaria de Seguridad Multidimensional de la OEA, Farah Urrutia, y de la Subsecretaria para Asuntos Multilaterales y Derechos Humanos de la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores de México, Marta Delgado Peralta. Nuestras distinguidas invitadas inaugurarán este diálogo que esperamos sea una serie de fructíferos encuentros para analizar este relevante tema. Agradezco mucho su atención. Cedo la palabra a nuestras invitadas de honor. Muy buenos días.
Muchas gracias, embajadora Baños. A continuación le damos la bienvenida a la doctora Farah Urrutia. Ella es la secretaria de Seguridad Multidimensional de la OEA y nos hablará sobre la importancia de abordar el extremismo violento. Adelante, secretaria, buenos días.
Muchísimas gracias, Andrea. Para mí también es un honor estar en este acto de apertura, acompañada de la embajadora Baños y de la subsecretaria Marta Delgado de la Secretaría de Exteriores de México, así como también con las diversas autoridades de México y de CICTE que nos acompañan en este momento. Desde la Secretaría de Seguridad Multidimensional de la OEA les extiendo una cordial bienvenida al diálogo virtual Prevención del Extremismo Violento, organizado por la Secretaría del Comité Interamericano contra el Terrorismo con la colaboración del Gobierno de México. Realmente es un honor llevar a cabo este encuentro de manera conjunta con la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores de México y contar con la activa participación de Canadá en su calidad de presidente del Comité Interamericano contra el Terrorismo. Este es el primer evento organizado por la Secretaría de CICTE en apoyo a los Estados miembros de la OEA para facilitar la comprensión de las amenazas que presenta el extremismo violento, los elementos del extremismo violento que conducen o pueden conducir a terrorismo y el intercambio de buenas prácticas y lecciones aprendidas para prevenir, abordar y contrarrestar este fenómeno. Esta iniciativa se enmarca en la declaración Fortaleciendo esfuerzos hemisféricos para abordar y contrarrestar el extremismo violento que conduce al terrorismo, señalada por la embajadora Baños, aprobada en el año 2018 por los miembros de la OEA durante el 28º periodo ordinario de sesiones de CICTE. En la declaración, los Estados miembros expresaron su compromiso para prevenir y combatir el extremismo violento desde una perspectiva integral y multidimensional. Es por esta razón que en este primer encuentro, porque se espera que sea el primero de varios encuentros sobre la materia, hemos propuesto dos grandes líneas para la reflexión. Primero, entender de mejor manera este fenómeno y sus manifestaciones alrededor del mundo. Segundo, sensibilizar sobre la importancia de abordar este fenómeno teniendo en cuenta las características particulares de nuestro hemisferio, así como sus fortalezas y desafíos. Esperamos que con ello facilitar una mejor comprensión de este fenómeno y la adopción de medidas necesarias para su prevención y abordaje. En la próxima hora y media se realizará una aproximación a qué es el extremismo violento, cuáles son las principales tendencias a nivel global y hemisférico, cuáles son los principales instrumentos multilaterales para prevenir y combatir el extremismo violento y cuáles son algunas de las diferentes perspectivas desde las cuales se debe atender este fenómeno. También se tendrá presente en las discusiones el impacto o potencial impacto dentro de la coyuntura de la pandemia COVID-19, porque la amenaza del terrorismo y en particular del extremismo violento que podría conducir al terrorismo continúa presente de diversas formas. Así, la coyuntura actual nos obliga a cuestionar y estudiar con mayor detenimiento cómo se están aprovechando los extremistas violentos de la situación actual y cuáles son las manifestaciones de extremismo violento en la actual coyuntura. Para concluir, nuevamente quisiera agradecer de manera muy especial a la subsecretaria para Asuntos Multilaterales y Derechos Humanos de México, Marta Delgado Peralta, a la embajadora Elena Baños, representante permanente de México ante la OEA, al embajador Hugh Adsett, representante permanente de Canadá ante la OEA y presidente del Comité Interamericano contra el Terrorismo, y a sus equipos por todo su apoyo que nos ha permitido unar esfuerzos para llevar a cabo este encuentro virtual. Agradezco también a cada uno de los distinguidos oradores y participantes que nos están acompañando, porque es fundamental fortalecer los vínculos de cooperación y coordinación en todos los niveles y entre todos los sectores para convertir los desafíos en oportunidades y conjuntamente buscar respuestas prácticas y efectivas para combatir y prevenir el terrorismo. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a ustedes.
Andrea, microphone.
Bien, le damos ahora la palabra a la señora Marta Delgado Peralta, la subsecretaria para Asuntos Multilaterales y Derechos Humanos de la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores de México. Adelante, subsecretaria.
Si me escuchan, ¿me pueden dar oportunidad de tener el video? Gracias. Buenos días, Andrea, muchas gracias. Muy distinguida doctora Farah Urrutia, secretaria de Seguridad Multidimensional de la Organización de Estados Americanos, embajador Hugh Adsett, representante permanente de Canadá ante la Organización de Estados Americanos y presidente del Comité Interamericano contra el Terrorismo, querida embajadora Elena Baños, representante permanente de México ante la OEA. Desde la Ciudad de México, bienvenidas y bienvenidos a este diálogo virtual que es auspiciado por el Comité Interamericano contra el Terrorismo de la Organización de Estados Americanos. A nombre del Gobierno de México, del canciller Marcelo Ebrard, me gustaría expresar mi agradecimiento al CICTE por la excelente colaboración que ha tenido con el Gobierno de México para la realización de este importante evento. Me gustaría mucho también agradecer a los especialistas que han aceptado participar para platicarnos de los temas relevantes y a los participantes que se han conectado el día de hoy. Veo 255 personas en este diálogo que forma parte de las actividades del Programa para la Prevención del Extremismo Violento del CICTE. Yo estoy segura que el intercambio de puntos de vista que hoy se va a dar va a ser muy importante para detonar y promover un mejor seguimiento del fenómeno del extremismo violento que puede conducir al terrorismo desde una perspectiva hemisférica, a fin de entender los desafíos que tenemos en nuestra región. El terrorismo y el extremismo violento son un reto en la seguridad y en el bienestar de las sociedades. En los últimos meses, ataques como los de Toronto, los de Christchurch, El Paso o Hanau nos han demostrado esta sombría realidad. Tan solo en el año 2018, más de 9.600 ataques terroristas tuvieron lugar en todo el mundo y más de 22.980, casi 23.000 muertos y casi 16.000 han resultado heridos. Cuando hacemos mención a estos fenómenos en América Latina y el Caribe, solemos pensar que estos lamentables hechos de violencia en su mayoría suceden lejos de nosotros, lejos de casa, no lo tenemos muy cerca y desafortunadamente la realidad es que nuestros países no están exentos de sufrir estos ataques o también nuestros connacionales que están en otros países también pueden enfrentar actos extremistas de grupos radicales. El 3 de agosto del año 2019, un individuo que se identificó con una ideología de extrema derecha entró a un Walmart en El Paso, Texas, y acabó con la vida de 22 personas, entre ellos 8 mexicanos. Y este trágico evento nos demostró los efectos devastadores que puede tener un solo individuo radicalizado por una ideología extremista violenta cuando tiene acceso a armas de alto poder. También nos demostró que quizá un tema que no estaba en el orden de prioridad principal en nuestro país se convirtió de un día para otro en una, jerárquicamente en una prioridad. La capacidad de este individuo de distribuir sus mensajes y sus acciones a través de Internet en tiempo real, como desafortunadamente hemos podido constatar, destacan la magnitud del reto al que nos enfrentamos también con todo el acceso que existe a las armas y a las redes sociales. El uso de armas de alto calibre en las manos equivocadas puede generar efectos devastadores en cuestión de minutos. Por lo tanto, para atender integralmente el fenómeno del extremismo violento que puede conducir al terrorismo, también es muy importante considerar el papel que juega el fácil acceso a las armas ligeras y pequeñas, incluyendo los mecanismos para evitar el desvío y el tráfico ilícito de este tipo de armas. Para México, los sucesos del Paso y también en otras partes del mundo han sido una llamada de atención sobre la necesidad de atender a nivel regional este fenómeno y en diversas instancias multilaterales. El creciente fenómeno del extremismo violento, que también puede conducir al terrorismo, es hoy parte de nuestra política exterior. Esta agenda se encuentra alineado con la política transformadora de México a través del eje de paz sostenible que busca atender las causas subyacentes estructurales de la violencia, de tal forma que tenemos que sentar las bases para una paz que perdure a través de un respeto pleno a los derechos humanos. Los Estados miembros de la OEA nos hemos beneficiado de la experiencia y del valioso trabajo del CICTE para implementar una arquitectura multilateral de prevención al combate, prevención y combate al terrorismo en nuestra región, a partir de el fortalecimiento de las capacidades nacionales, del intercambio de mejores prácticas en la materia y, por supuesto, de todos los cambios que se tienen que dar a nivel institucional para enfrentar este fenómeno. Se trata de combatir el terrorismo y el extremismo violento en nuestro hemisferio. No hay mecanismo que conozca mejor la región y sus necesidades particulares, y por eso nos da muchísimo gusto el trabajo del CICTE junto con el gobierno de Canadá, que podamos iniciar esta discusión de suma relevancia para entender, pero también para atender estos fenómenos desde una perspectiva integral y multidimensional. Quisiera reconocer la participación de Naciones Unidas, de la Dirección Ejecutiva del Comité contra el Terrorismo en este encuentro, la coordinación de todos los actores para llevar a cabo una acción efectiva de prevención y atención de diversos fenómenos que están vinculados, por ejemplo, el discurso de odio, el supremacismo blanco, el extremismo violento, todo esto en la idea de que México busca trabajar cerca del CICTE y los países miembros de la OEA para promover muchas sinergias de apoyo, mucho trabajo conjunto en la región para implementar juntos las convenciones internacionales en esta materia y las resoluciones que han sido relevantes dentro de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas y su Consejo de Seguridad. Nosotros creemos que en particular son importantes las que abordan el tema de radicalización y extremismo, como la 2230 de 2015, la 2396 del 2017 y la declaración fortaleciendo los esfuerzos hemisféricos para abordar y contrarrestar el extremismo violento que conduce al terrorismo. Nos parece además que debemos dar una mayor difusión y seguimiento a las recomendaciones que han sido contenidas en el Plan de Acción del Secretario General de la ONU para prevenir el extremismo violento. Finalmente, quisiera destacar la importancia de la participación de la sociedad civil y la academia en estos esfuerzos. Quisiéramos agradecer al Anti-Defamation League y Glocal Connection por aportar su experiencia y su visión en esta discusión. Este seminario, que será el primero de otras actividades que tenemos programadas realizar con el CICTE, busca aportar el entendimiento de este fenómeno, la necesidad de tener respuestas aterrizadas regionalmente y responder algunas preguntas sobre el extremismo violento. Por ejemplo, ¿por qué la gente se radicaliza? ¿En qué momento un individuo o un grupo decide usar la violencia para promover su ideología extremista? ¿O cómo podríamos prevenir la radicalización violenta respetando también el derecho a la libertad de expresión? ¿Qué medidas se pueden adoptar desde los diferentes países para mejorar los controles de las armas de alto poder que pueden ser usadas en este tipo de ataques? O, por ejemplo, ¿qué efectos puede tener la pandemia del COVID-19 en la propagación de discursos extremistas violentos? Muchas gracias. Estoy segura que este diálogo va a ser una gran experiencia para todos los participantes. También me parece importante que contribuya este diálogo a detonar una discusión profunda y sobre todo a que estos temas deben de ser presentados una vez cada determinado y largo tiempo, sino que se conviertan en discusiones que sean permanentes, sistemáticas en la región. A todas y todos, muchas gracias por su atención.
Muchísimas gracias, subsecretaria, y aprovecho de agradecer también al resto de nuestras autoridades. Le damos la bienvenida a aquellos participantes que recién se incorporan. Tenemos conectados en este momento más de 250 participantes. Aprovecho también para recordarles que tenemos interpretación simultánea disponible. Si se fijan en la pantalla, podrán ubicar el icono de interpretación. Allí podrán seleccionar el idioma de su preferencia, ya que tendremos presentaciones en inglés y en español. Y es muy importante, por favor, que seleccionen silenciar el audio original para que de esta manera no tengan ninguna interferencia. Bien, ahora le doy la palabra a la señora Alison Treppel, quien es la secretaria ejecutiva del Comité Interamericano contra el Terrorismo de la OEA, y va a moderar nuestro primer panel, en donde estaremos abordando qué es el extremismo violento y cuáles son las principales tendencias, tanto a nivel global como a nivel hemisférico. Adelante, Alison.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Good morning to all. A very warm welcome on behalf of the Secretariat of the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism for your participation here today. I think the fact that you are here, logged on and listening is a sign of your commitment with us to help to address this issue of violent extremism. For too long, so that we can stay on schedule, we heard excellent introductory remarks from both the Secretary and Secretary Urrutia. So I will just say that Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism has been looking at these issues for 20 years. The issue of violent extremism in particular is something that began to take on renewed focus 2 years ago in 2018 with the issuing of the declaration that was previously referred to. So this event is really an opportunity for us to begin to even deepen our analysis of violent extremism, the drivers, if you will, both globally and perhaps more importantly for those connected here today for our region, for the Western Hemisphere. And so we thought it would be helpful to begin this conversation sort of with a primer, if you will, an introduction to violent extremism. What are some of the trends? What are the different manifestations? And so to help us launch this, we have invited two very distinguished experts in the field to join us on this first panel, who will indeed help us to begin to address this topic here over the next hour and a half. So I am joined in this panel first, who is the Vice President of the Center on Extremism of the Anti-Defamation League. Oren, you can please release your camera and join me on screen. As the Vice President of the Center on Extremism, Oren and his team are responsible for combating extremism, terror, all forms of hate in the real world and online. Recognized as the foremost authority on extremism, the center provides resources, expertise, and training to enable law enforcement, public officials, internet and technology companies better identify and counter emerging threats. With that, Oren, I am pleased to welcome you and to offer you the floor.
Thank you very much, Alison. Very much appreciated. And let me start by saying first thank you to the government of Mexico and the Organization of American States for having me for this important discussion. As Alison mentioned, I'm the Vice President of the ADL Center on Extremism. And the mission of ADL, which began 106 years ago, is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all people. You know, this mission is something that continues to motivate our efforts on all the work that we do, including our work to combat extremism. Indeed, the Center on Extremism is the research and analysis arm. We're tracking and monitoring extremist movements and groups and individuals, both online and on the ground every single day. The idea is to better understand what motivates extremists? What are the narratives? What is the language? What are the codes? Why do people choose to become part of these movements? And then leverage these findings, both with the public, with our law enforcement partners to keep our communities safe, to force social media companies to take a greater stand against the exploitation of their services, but ultimately it's to protect communities, to stand and be allies with communities that are impacted every day by these extremists. So we are motivated by the knowledge that fighting anti-Semitism is strengthened by fighting all forms of hatred and bigotry. And we also recognize that the only way to fight bigotry and hatred and the extremism that comes along is to fight anti-Semitism. The extremists that we monitor, the extremists that we push back against every single day, remind us of this precious mission that we have. Now, it seems that every week, unfortunately, is an anniversary of a violent extremist incident, a reminder of the impact that divisive ideologies and beliefs can have on communities, on families, and on friends. Indeed, this coming Monday will be a year since the white supremacist terrorist took the lives of 23 people at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, which made it one of the deadliest domestic terror attacks in American history. It was also the most horrific attack against the Hispanic community in modern US memory. Now, I'm going to focus my opening remarks on what we have seen here in the United States, but its impact goes well beyond any one country, and frankly, beyond just this hemisphere. I think it's important, though, to start by defining a few terms. So extremism, as we see it at ADL, is a concept, and it describes religious, social, or political belief systems that exist significantly outside of belief systems that are more commonly and broadly accepted. And so you have mainstream beliefs, and then you have extremist beliefs. And these extreme ideologies often seek radical change in the nature of government, in religion, or in society as a whole. Extremists can also refer to a very radical or violent wing of broader movements. So for example, there's an environmental movement, and that's not extreme at all. People can love the planet, people can love animals, but those who choose to push forward an agenda through violence would be, a sense, an extremist part of movements that can exist. So it's both ideological and it's both tactical. Now, not every extremist movement over the years has been considered quote unquote bad, right? When you think of the abolitionist movement to free slavery as an example of a movement that was outside of the mainstream, but very admirable. And so most extremist movements, when we talk about them today, are movements that not only exist outside of the mainstream, but that their tactics, their ideologies are objectionable as well. And in terms of violent extremism, these are individuals who are motivated by ideological, religious, social ideas and are either engaging in, encouraging, condoning acts of violence on behalf of their agenda. And so the El Paso shooter is an example of this combination of extremist ideas and violent actions. You know, he is believed to have posted a manifesto online prior to the attack, justifying his deadly spree. You know, in it, he describes a culture, an ethnic replacement brought on by an invasion, right? It's one of the most telling elements is that he actually expressed support for this concept by expressing his support for the Christchurch shooter, somebody who killed 51 Muslims in New Zealand in March of 2019. So we've seen surging violence in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, motivated by ideologies that are animating people in this country and around the world. In fact, we are witnessing the internationalization of the movement of white supremacy that is not dissimilar to what we saw with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, right? The narratives of ISIS and Al-Qaeda ideology seeping into this hemisphere through technology, or individuals traveling abroad. This same thing is happening. It's not that we are importing, we are now exporting our terrorist ideas, our extremist narratives, and even our extremists themselves. So like the El Paso shooter, the Christchurch shooter also turned to social media, in particular, a platform called 8chan, to post a manifesto to explain his deadly rampage, which he called the Great Replacement. And in it, he fixated on white supremacist notion that European society will be overrun by migration from Muslim and African countries. You know, just 1 month later, after he issued this manifesto, explicitly directing people to do their part and support these concepts, we saw in Poway, California, an innocent woman killed and others injured by a man who also posted his manifesto, offering the same kind of white supremacist tropes as we saw in Christchurch, and then later in El Paso. So in each case I mentioned, all leveraged a particular platform to spread their message. 3 white supremacist attacks, one targeting Muslims, one targeting Jews, and another targeting the Latinx community and immigrants. Each of the alleged perpetrators spread their propaganda and leveraged the internet as a weapon. We are seeing extremists prepare their social media strategies at the same time that they are actually preparing their weapons. That is the story of modern violent extremism and targeted violence in this country and abroad. You know, in the 12 months since the El Paso shooting, we have tracked extremist plots and other activities throughout the country. And the good news is we have not had an attack of that nature in this country since then. But that is not to say that extremists haven't been trying. You know, we have tracked in the Center on Extremism at least 18 terrorist incidents since El Paso, August 3rd of last year. These are attacks, attempted attacks, and plots. This includes 9 that were carried out by white supremacists, luckily foiled, anti-government extremists. We have involuntary celibates, anti-Muslim, anti-abortion. There is a range of ideologies that are motivating people to violent action in this country. And some of this activity begins with winning the hearts and minds of people at a time where there is more fear and anxiety and uncertainty because of pandemics, because of social unrest, because of economic concerns. I will tell you, extremists never miss an opportunity to leverage a crisis, be it a pandemic or be it a protest. You know, we have captive audiences. More and more of our time is spent on these platforms in which I'm speaking to you. Our children are spending more of their time online as well, as if we could have even imagined that we would be spending more time online than we had prior to the pandemic. But again, extremism thrives on fear and anxiety. And as we've seen, that this pandemic has quickly turned into a narrative for extremists to target the Asian community, where we've seen anti-Asian incidents in this country that we're tracking rise. We've seen conspiracy theories about Jews being responsible for the pandemic. We've seen extremists use it as an excuse to stop immigration, not because we want to stop the necessary flow of an infection, but because for extremists, immigration is diversity, and diversity is the virus itself. So in the wake of this pandemic, we have seen both on the ground and online a huge spike in calls about open borders being the virus, stopping the coronavirus by deporting illegal aliens. This is their language. Stopping immigration is viewed as an opportunity for extremists to leverage at this time. So we've seen this also spill into the George Floyd protests, right? Efforts by extremists across the ideological spectrum to use this opportunity to force political violence, to recruit, to radicalize, to reach people that they haven't before. Time and again, we're seeing extremists try to leverage these moments in time in order to gain adherence, which raises the possibility of violence. And as the election comes, I think we all have our work cut out for us. So I want to be respectful of time. I will say that looking ahead, our top priorities is for our leaders to clearly and forcefully call out hatred and extremism of all kinds at every opportunity. We need to do a better job through government of collecting data on domestic extremist threats. We cannot address what we are not measuring. We need to hold our social media companies and technology companies accountable for what they allow on their platforms, how they deal with those extremists who exploit their platforms, because that is how they are reaching and recruiting. And I will conclude with this and look forward to any questions in this follow-up, is that I don't want to be depressing. I really believe this moment in time will not be remembered only for the hatred, the extremism, and the violence, but what good people did in response to those incidents. That's what will be the most lasting impression as we get through this all together. So thank you, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you. Like you say, we don't want it to be sobering. We want to look at the opportunities here for ways to improve as we go forward, but certainly you shared with us really some powerful information, facts that I think will lead us well into our next presentation, and then perhaps we can circle back around at the end with some follow-up questions and maybe dig a little bit deeper on some of the issues that you have raised, particularly as to what is it, or what are some of the factors, the drivers that does behind that ideology that turns the extremism violent. This is an area of particular concern. But first, let me offer the floor to Dr. Bibi van Ginkel, who is the owner and founder of the Glocal Connection platform for shared security. This firm that's dedicated to facilitating multi-engagement on highly sensitive security issues with a special focus on rule of law and prevention solutions. Thank you so much, Bibi, for joining today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the government of Mexico and the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism for inviting me to talk to you. Greetings from The Hague in the Netherlands. Your Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen, I think the main question today is to look for effective responses, and that's about looking for prevention, timely interception, prosecution. And so our main question now is, why do people radicalize? Let me share my screen with you. Now, in order to understand why people radicalize, we also have to understand the process that they go through and the different questions and levels of interest that they develop while radicalizing to the point that they actually use violence. So it starts with curiosity and maybe grievances, questions like, this is not right. Then it moves to an interest, feelings of injustice and marginalization, saying this is not fair. And then it moves to a sympathy for those who stand up to that, or feelings of victimhood and attribution of guilt. Finally, it moves to support and ultimately to the legitimization of violence and even the belief that they themselves will have to use violence to stand up to this injustice. There are various drivers and push and pull factors that play a role. And you find them on a macro level, a meso and a micro level, and they always interact. There's not just one recipe to this radicalization. Each and every process is different, and each individual will respond differently to all these factors that play a role in their lives. So you have the individual and social psychological factors, the social factors such as social exclusion, marginalization, perceived and relative deprivation, discrimination or injustices and human rights violations, lack of education or socio-economic perspectives for professional careers, and a background in criminality. But there are also the outside factors, political factors that might drive people, from geopolitical aspects to the feelings of victimhood, identity crisis, or dichotomies like us versus them, lack of trust in government and authorities, lack of rule of law and good governance, corruption, and lack of service delivery. In addition to that, you might find that there are ideological or religious factors that play a role, cultural and identity crisis, or traumas that play a role in the background, like PTSD or other mental health issues. Overall, you will see that there are various motivational factors for those who really make that step to join organizations and to make that move to actually committing terrorist acts. They might be identity seekers or justice seekers, or sometimes it's just about a meaning of life or a thrill seeker. But outside the push factors, there might also be pull factors, pulling someone from outside into this radicalization or this violent extremism. And it could play a role through recruitment, social media, role models and preachers, propaganda, incitement. But it could also be economical, a lack of financial means and others who offer that, a lack of service delivery by government and others that offer that, the group dynamics that push you in a certain direction, or the lack of security if you don't join. So the group might provide that security. And of course, there is the overall political discourse in the public debate and polarization that plays a role. Now here you see the global trends as recorded by the Maryland University for the trends of last year. And you will see that there's hardly any continent that is free from these kinds of attacks. In terms of global trends, of course, we've always been focusing on what ISIS has been doing. And with the defeat of the caliphate, we have seen that it's transformed into a covert network. Remains a threat in a global organization with a centralized leadership, and also as a source of inspiration for others or lone wolves that operate on their own. There is also a proliferation of local chapters of ISIS and pledge of allegiances of local groups. ISIS might also be instrumentalizing local militias and capitalizing on local conflicts. In addition to that, we are dealing globally with returning and relocating fighters of ISIS. And of course, that also brings up questions and the disparities in policies on repatriation. There is always this question whether there is also a competition with Al-Qaeda and whether they drive each other to make the most violent attacks. Yet overall, looking at globally all the terrorist attacks, there is a decline. Yet there are always new emerging trends. One trend that is getting more focus now is this nexus with transnational organized crime, for instance, to obtain weapons. It was already mentioned by the previous speaker. And although this is considered to be a marriage of convenience, it's still something that globally governments are paying attention to. And of course, there are the other emerging trends like right and left-wing extremism and racially and ethnically motivated terrorism. Looking more to the regional trends, there is, and that was already mentioned by the previous speaker, there is an increase in attacks in the US last year for different ideological motivations, and that might make it very difficult to respond very effectively if you have to look at so many different backgrounds of these attacks. But overall, we can say that it has been exceptionally deadly with the racial and ethnically motivated terrorist attacks against Hispanic Americans in 2019. Now, for time purposes, I will not touch upon this, but I just briefly mentioned a couple of the international policy developments that are taking place, but I rather move to the impact of COVID-19 on the driving factors behind violent extremism. And clearly, we've seen an aggravating effect that is sort of capitalizing on already existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. And this is, of course, increasing the driving factors behind radicalization of violent extremism. Also, since we are all in lockdowns or in social isolation, there is lack of social control, there is more time spent on the internet, and this creates all kinds of opportunities for recruitment and cybercrime. And also there is less opportunities for civil society organizations to do communal countering and preventing violent extremist activities. There is room for all kinds of conspiracy theories, and these might make very nice narratives for those who try to recruit their followers. We see that the economic crisis, of course, drives terrorist organizations to find other supporters, and also has impact on the governments to effectively respond. And due to limiting freedoms and emergency powers, this might also fuel feelings of injustice with people who might then find reasons for that to radicalize. COVID-19 also has an impact on counterterrorism policies and countering and preventing violent extremist policies, and also the facilitating factors behind that. For instance, the impact on health and economy and the lack of service delivery by governments is an opportunity for alternative service delivery by terrorist organization. And as I mentioned, there are less resources available from governments and donors to support whole society approaches that are otherwise very effective in preventing violent extremism. And due to the main focus on health and economy, there is less focus on main security risks that might occur, that also offers opportunities for those who want to take advantage of that. Transnational organized crimes might also profit from the situation at hand, and that will offer terrorist organizations nice opportunities to link up in these marriages of convenience for their financial support. Although there are also some positive developments, I must say. So for instance, since we are all in lockdowns, there is less recruitment activities in the public space and other offline activities. There is less media attention for terrorist attacks and less visibility, which otherwise always drives terrorist organizations also in their recruitment and propaganda activities. And there might also be discontent with the leadership of terrorist organizations, as they also cannot protect the people against COVID-19. Now, coming to an end, I wanted to also share some ideas on how to deal with COVID-19 in relation to counterterrorism and countering and preventing violent extremism. And this offers a couple of ideas that we can further discuss. First of all, it's very important for international organizations and governments to invest in effective communication to undermine conspiracy theories and on effective health and economic intervention by governments. And you have to do this by targeting different audiences and using different means and being sure that you reach these audiences, speak their language. It's also important to keep strengthening the capacity of community leaders and civil society organizations, as they are the first responders to changes in societies, and they have an easy access to the communities to communicate and prevent them from diverging from that path. While doing all this, it's important that governments refrain from human rights violations and the abuse of emergency powers, because that would otherwise be another reason for radicalization. And also we have to prepare against modified terrorist tactics. For instance, by protecting our critical infrastructure like test centers and hospitals, and prepare for spreading campaigns and the abuse that terrorists might take by infecting the population. And of course, there is need to continue to support countries in their CT and CPVE activities, those that are really in need for this kind of financial support in their activities. Some final observations, if you allow me. I think that the 4 pillars of the Organization of American States are also key pillars in the comprehensive and effective approach to preventing and countering violent extremism and countering terrorism. Yet so far, it seems that the focus of the organization seems to be on security approaches. So a more integrated approach is merited, and we can discuss how we can follow up on that. While doing so, respecting human rights while countering terrorism and violent extremism is more than a ticking the box exercise and needs specification and concrete instructions on how to do so. It's therefore important to mainstream this throughout the approach in every possible way, including impact assessment on CT measures and human rights enjoyment, policy developments, and the implementation and training. Regional organizations play a key role in capacity building and implementation. And it's very important that they link up with the global trends and the global policies that are developed, and therefore make a bridge with the local and the regional connections. They have a better understanding of the local context and can much easier build a network of relevant multi-sectoral stakeholders. Meanwhile, regional organizations can take inspiration from and build on developments in organizations such as the UN and the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, of which Canada is now the co-chair. Finally, monitoring and evaluation, and I cannot stress this enough. Not doing this means that you are crossing the road blindfolded. It's therefore imperative that this is built into all the response mechanisms. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I give the floor back to the chair.
Thank you so much, Bibi, for that very comprehensive presentation. You've touched on so many different points. Between the two of you, I think we've really covered a very introductory look at violent extremism, some of the root causes, the drivers, factors that are affecting it, and the role of different sectors of society. I don't know that we're going to have a lot of time for questions, but let me try to follow up with just a couple of ideas. One, in particular, I'm going to reference the map that Bibi included in her presentation, but I think this question could be addressed for both of you. I would like to know, at least from the civil society perspective here, what specific ideas or recommendations would you have for those in this hemisphere, either government, private sector, or individuals alike, who would argue that extremist activity has just been an isolated event in certain places? It's really not a concern for this hemisphere. What would you say to people to help convince that more attention needs to be placed on this issue for the Western Hemisphere? Bibi, why don't you go ahead and start, please?
Thank you very much, Alison. I think, well, the map shows that no continent is free from violent extremism. And if you look at the long-term trends over the years, over the centuries, I might add, that this phenomenon is always moving and evolving and always capitalizing on vulnerabilities in society. And unfortunately, there is no region, no country that is free from these kind of vulnerabilities. And of course, it all depends on how well structured the responses are, whether you can have strong governments, strong agencies that make sure that they have good governance, rule of law in place, that they are free of corruption, human rights are respected, that there are equal opportunities economically and socially for people. So you take away these vulnerabilities in societies, and those drivers and underlying factors that might otherwise be abused by terrorist organizations or extremists to lure these people to join their organization, to stand up because they don't see any other alternatives anymore. In essence, I always think that it's very simple. And the most effective governments can be in their response is by not making mistakes that will give a free path for extremist organizations to capitalize on that. And I mean, also the Western Hemispheric is not free from polarization discussions that drive people apart, the economy of us versus them, or peace processes which can easily be derailed if service delivery and promises are not met. When trust in the authorities is declining, that's when governments and countries become vulnerable for these kinds of influences. So I think this is a very timely discussion. And I think the Organization on American States, with their 4 pillars on democracy, human rights, on security and development, has the perfect cocktail actually to support the governments of the OIS in approaching this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the recognition of the work of multilateral organizations today. But Oren, go ahead, the same question to you, please.
Yeah, so part of what I heard in your question, Alison, was, you know, the idea that some people don't think it's as big of a problem. And I think when you look at the data, I mean, we see, especially in the past couple of years, this rise in mass casualty shooting motivated by extremists. That's terrorism. But we can't only look at these big, deadly, you know, life-changing events that occur. There's a whole set of other data and information that suggests that extremism is actually getting quite normalized beyond the violent elements of it. So for example, we know that whether your kids are on TikTok or a gaming app or platform, or whether you're on Facebook and Twitter, extremist narratives, hateful concepts exist in the same space as legitimate news. That has never been the case for most of human history, but over the past several years, the accessibility to the type of hatred, to the type of narratives and tropes that motivate people to violence is easier to access than ever before. That is in part having an impact on what we're seeing on the ground, to the point where even in a COVID world or a protest world, you are seeing extremists who never miss an opportunity to leverage not only the public discussion to mainstream their ideas, but who are literally going on the ground. And so while most of the protests we have seen in this country against police brutality and for social justice have not been extremist in any way, we need not devalue the real protest there. We are tracking individual extremists and, you know, cohorts who are showing up on the ground because they know people are so scared. They're so concerned. The idea that, you know, the numbers aren't as bad as, say, in other parts of the world misses the fact that we are just normalizing this. The Overton window has moved. What I would see when I first started doing this work 20 years ago on some fringe platform is literally leading our news. The narratives is literally coming from the mouths of our elected officials. And so to wrap this up and answer the what do we do about it, is we need to hold our social media companies responsible. This is what is normalizing hate more than anything else. It's our phones, it's not our cable TV channels. 2 is ask our elected officials, ask our public officials of all kinds to actually reject hatred when it comes out and not promote it. We're literally back to the basics on that. And that shows, again, the normalization of extremist narratives. And finally, I mean, again, for civil society organizations, it's to stand up and be allies at a time of polarization. So when one community is impacted, it's responsible of all communities to reach out and say, this is not going to be okay. We will resource to the threat, whether that's through advocacy, whether that's through our voice, or whether that's through showing our data. So happy to share more data after this on our heat map and on our website to show people violent extremism starts with nonviolent acts, and all of those have significantly increased.
Thank you very much. I want to do just one final question, and then I want to move on to the panel just in the interest of time. But the fact that we are meeting here online today is a result of our current situation, which is the pandemic and the movement to teleworking, teleeducation, everything at the moment. So if you could, and Oren, I'll start with you, just 60 seconds, if possible, if we can even summarize it to that extent. We've mentioned, Bibi in particular went into greater detail on the impact that the pandemic is having on extremist activity. Is there anything in the short term? A lot of the recommendations are more medium, longer term policy type adjustments. Is there anything in the short term, given the fact that in all likelihood, you to be working online, at least in some capacity for the near future? Any specific suggestions on what could be done to try to tamper down some of this movement?
Yes, you know, ADL is currently in the process of a campaign, helping lead a campaign with partners with the NAACP, Color for Change, and others. It's called Stop Hate for Profit. And what we're doing is holding social media, in particular Facebook, at this campaign accountable for the hate and extremism that is on their platforms. At a time during a pandemic where more people need to rely on these tools to have that human connection with others, to avoid isolation, we need to make sure that these platforms are safer than ever before. And that means that everybody, whether you're a civil society organization, government, individual, can focus on these companies and say, you need to address the hate on your platforms. They'll say it's not easy. It is not unreasonable to say, here are the steps that you can take. On the ADL website, we have 10 things that we're asking these companies to do. We're seeing this have an impact. I will note corporations around the country and around the world have signed on to this. And so for the month of July, many of them actually stopped doing ads on Facebook, just as a sign that people are taking this seriously. I can't think of a more important time to have the industry, that is the social media platforms, take their exploitation more seriously than during this pandemic. It will actually impact the future of how people communicate. That is a significant and concrete thing that people can do.
Bibi?
Thank you. Yeah, I think in addition to the importance of communication that Oren just mentioned, and I also highlighted earlier, I think first of all, I'd like to stress again that it all begins by not making mistakes as governments. And although that's how we are not without faults, all of us, but it's important to keep that in mind. And particularly since research also shows that human rights violations are very important drivers towards radicalization to extremism. So particularly in this time of the COVID pandemic, it's very easy for governments to use emergency powers and to limit freedoms, but they really have to do that in full respect of the limits to those authorities that they have. And to do that in a very restrictive manner. In addition to that, I think it's very important to keep your connection on the local level with your communities, with your grassroots leaders, with credible messengers who can actually reach out to the communities in the streets. So you have, first of all, a good feel of what's going on. And second of all, they are the ones that can find out what is actually needed in these communities to prevent these processes from derailing. So I think those are two main aspects, and these are a very important part of a comprehensive counterterrorism and countering and preventing violent extremism strategy.
Thank you both so much again for your participation in this panel. I will be doing a wrap up at the end of the session today where I will highlight some of your main takeaways. But with that, thank you for your participation in panel 1. Andrea, the floor back over to you.
Thank you, Alison, y muchísimas gracias a nuestros distinguidos panelistas, la doctora Bibi Van Ginkel, fundadora de Glocal Connection, plataforma de seguridad compartida, y Oren Segal, vicepresidenta del Centro sobre Extremismo de la Liga Anti-Defamación. Ahora quiero darle la bienvenida nuevamente a la embajadora Elena Baños, representante de México ante la OEA, quien moderará el segundo y último panel del día de hoy, donde estaremos abordando cuáles son algunos de los principales instrumentos multilaterales para prevenir y combatir el extremismo violento y cuáles son estas diferentes perspectivas desde las cuales se debe abordar este fenómeno. Adelante, embajadora.
Muchas gracias. Tenemos poco tiempo, pero nos da mucho gusto dar la bienvenida al embajador Hugh Adsett, que cuenta con una amplia experiencia en materia de política internacional y relaciones internacionales de su país, habiéndose unido al Departamento de Asuntos Exteriores y Comercio Internacional en 1995. En la Cancillería de Canadá trabajó en la División de Consolidación de la Paz y en la sección de Derecho de los Derechos Humanos en la Oficina de Asuntos Jurídicos, de la cual también fue su director general. Se desempeñó como subdirector de la sección de Derecho Ambiental, como director de la División de Derecho Penal, de Seguridad y Diplomático, como director de la División de las Naciones Unidas, Derechos Humanos y Derecho Económico, y como director general de la Oficina de Política Exterior. En el extranjero, inició su carrera en Etiopía, posteriormente se incorporó a la Misión Permanente de Canadá ante Naciones Unidas. Fue nombrado representante permanente de su país ante la Organización de los Estados Americanos en octubre de 2019 y en esta calidad preside el Comité Interamericano contra el Terrorismo, CICTE. Muy bienvenido, señor embajador. Tiene usted la palabra.
Muchísimas gracias, embajadora. It's very much a pleasure to be here and to see you this afternoon. And also to see so many colleagues as well. And let me begin, of course, by thanking the government of Mexico for hosting this meeting, and also thanking the Organization of American States. Greetings, of course, Ambassador, not only to you, but also to Executive Secretary Alison Treppel and Farah Urrutia, Secretary for Multidimensional Security, for being with us today as well. I know that time is a bit limited, so let me embark directly into a few comments. And let me start by saying that fostering practical cooperation and concrete action against terrorism and transnational crime in this hemisphere is a priority for Canada. We've been very honored to have the opportunity to chair CICTE, the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism, since the spring of 2019. And in that time, we've tried to focus our efforts on discussion on how to build resilient communities. I think a crucial element in being able to prevent and respond to violent extremism and to terrorism. Unfortunately, terrorism and violent extremism remain an enduring concern, both globally and in the hemisphere. And this extremists, particularly far-right violent extremists and white supremacist groups, are using the COVID-19 pandemic to advance violent xenophobic narratives, recruit new members, carry out acts of violence. Oren Segal noted some of these points in what he was saying earlier. We've seen this as well. Reports of violent, racist, and xenophobic attacks against Chinese and other Asian ethnic groups and people of Jewish faith have increased since the beginnings of the pandemic. 320% increase in attacks conducted by individuals affiliated with far-right violent extremist movements and ideologies over the past 5 years. That's info from the UN Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate. So, a troubling situation. How can we approach this issue? Well, from our perspective, several factors are key to preventing and countering violent extremism. First, in the long term, civilian-led, evidence-based efforts that respect human rights emphasize the importance of inclusion and diversity, and build on local strengths and capabilities to foster community resilience are of critical importance. Terrorist attacks, violent extremism, they're not the exclusive domain of one people in one part of the world. We are all vulnerable, and the map that Bibi van Ginkel displayed, I think, illustrates that well. No matter where we live, no matter who we are, no matter what we do. And I think for us, taking a human-centered approach in safeguarding human rights and the rule of law is crucial to being able to counter terrorism and violent extremism. Second, a whole of society approach consistent with the UN's plan of action on preventing violent extremism is needed. Third, and I want to speak a couple minutes about this issue, integrating gender considerations and the women, peace, and security agenda into international efforts to counter terrorism and prevent and combat violent extremism is of critical importance. Evidence shows that violent extremist and terrorist organizations use gender to recruit and to maintain members. They count on and strategically exploit what you might describe as gender blind spots, unconscious biases to their tactical and operational advantage. And it's gender messaging that's used not only to recruit men, but also women and youth. For example, Daesh used gender messaging to recruit over 40,000 people from over 100 countries, 20% of whom were women. And I can give a short example of that. Daesh used Muslim women's negative experiences of prejudice based on the intersection of race, religion, and gender across many European countries as a propaganda and a recruiting tool. And we're able to use concepts of empowerment, sisterhood, the discourse of state building to speak to women's desire to regain independence, autonomy, and control through a seemingly Islamic framework. I mention this because I think it's an example that goes to illustrate the way in which extremist and terrorist organizations craft messages, and in this specific example, gender messaging, as a way to enhance recruitment. And it's one of the issues that we need to not only be alert to, but to take action to address. Youth as well, that's I think the fourth important element of our approach. We've recognized the critical importance of engaging youth in countering violent extremism, especially online, and that's been mentioned already. The context of online spaces, youth are often most at risk of exploitation by violent extremist and terrorist groups, but they can also be powerful actors in opposing those groups and in developing alternative counter narratives and leading positive changes amongst their peers. So Alison, I think as you were saying, an important part of this approach that we take is, of course, not only to be conscious of the negative, but also to build on strengths and positive. And amongst youth, there are opportunities and ability to be very strong, powerful actors to counter violent extremism. Internationally, we've done work with a number of organizations. I'm going to list a few. Some of the forums where Canada has worked include the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum. It's a Countering Violent Extremism Working Group, the 5-country ministerial, the Christchurch Call to Action, the G7 Roma Lyon Group, and the Global Coalition to Counter Daesh. Along with the Kingdom of Morocco, as I was mentioned a bit earlier, we're co-chairing, Canada's co-chairing the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum. That body is an informal group, 30 members. It includes 2 other OAS member states, Colombia and the United States, and works to identify and develop innovative solutions to address critical counterterrorism gaps and challenges. We're also a member of the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism's Independent Advisory Committee. That group works to accelerate responses to violent, extremist, and terrorist use of the internet and encourages civil society dialogue. And again, a point mentioned earlier, positive messaging online. So we've worked in that series of groups and others to try to share experiences and develop policy and approaches. We've also made a commitment to support these efforts through funding, through our counterterrorism capacity building program. That program helps reduce threats by strengthening community resilience through youth empowerment and promoting tolerance, supporting community policing, and improving communication between communities, civil society, and security providers. I could give perhaps just one example of the work that we've done in that area. We've provided support to the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, which works on building resilience amongst vulnerable communities, including youth. And one of the ways that that has been done is through training courses that are designed to allow or to alert participants to warning signs of radicalization in order to help prevent violent extremism. The idea is that parents and community leaders and peers then have access to tools to be able to identify when a person may be at risk, and not only access to those tools, but through the training that's provided, the confidence to be able to make interventions so that steps can actually be taken to try to prevent violent extremism in the first place. Perhaps if I could, in order to be conscious of the time we have, just say a few words about how Canada's been working to counter the threat of violent extremism within its own borders. The Canadian government is concerned with all forms of violent extremism, while not associating this phenomenon with any particular ideological, religious, or political group. To address the issue of preventing radicalization to violence and its impact on social cohesion, the Canadian government launched the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence in 2017, and that centre focuses on developing policy guidance, coordination and collaboration, funding planning, and coordinating research and supporting interventions. We've, through a fund called the Community Resilience Fund, been able to provide funding to programs in Canada to counter radicalization, as well as support research to enhance the understanding of the domestic threat posed by violent extremism, but also to study what works best. And again, I think this is part of the value of discussions like we're having today, and I think something that we would like to continue to do, which is to share best practices, to share information on what is effective, what works to counter radicalization in a bias-sensitive way. I might refer just to a couple of the programs that we have launched in Canada. One is a research project on updating a scan, an environmental scan of right-wing extremism. It's carried out by a university in Canada, the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, collaborating with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. What this project does is provide an overview of the groups and motivations and activities and connections, including an online space, that characterize far-right violent extremist groups in Canada. There's another example, the Organization for Prevention of Violence. This is in one Canadian province, a hybrid model that focuses on countering violent extremism and hate in one particular Canadian province is where the work is being done, and that's being done through community-based intervention, programming, and research. It's a bit of an overview of our approach and some of the activities we have undertaken and some of the thoughts that we hope it might be useful to share. Let me close by saying how much we appreciated this opportunity to be able to speak with you, and we look forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, señor embajador. Gracias por sus reflexiones. Ha sido una mañana muy importante, visibilizando cuáles son los principales elementos analíticos para comprender mejor este fenómeno tan desafiante para nuestro tiempo. Complementaremos nuestra sesión de hoy con la participación de Michèle Coninsx. Ella es directora ejecutiva contra el terrorismo de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas, nombrada por el secretario general Antonio Guterres en agosto de 2017, tras el acuerdo del Consejo de Seguridad. Actualmente es presidenta de Eurojust, la Unidad de Cooperación Judicial de la Unión Europea, presidenta del equipo antiterrorista de Eurojust y del grupo de trabajo sobre el futuro de Eurojust. Su experiencia es vasta, habiéndose unido a Pro Eurojust como fiscal general adjunta en 2001 y convertirse en miembro nacional de Bélgica en Eurojust en 2002. Antes fue nombrada fiscal nacional y se desempeñó como fiscal adjunta de la Fiscalía de Bruselas. Fungió también como experta de la Organización de Aviación Civil Internacional e instructora antiterrorista en el aire, con asignación en el Comité de Seguridad de la Aviación Nacional de Bélgica. Posee una maestría en Derecho y una maestría en Criminología de la Universidad de Bruselas y está especializada en Derecho Aéreo por el Real Instituto Superior de Defensa de Bruselas. Es profesora visitante en el Colegio de Europa y en la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Queen Mary de Londres y miembro honorario en Derecho y Criminología en la Universidad de Bruselas. Muy bienvenida, doctora, tiene usted la palabra.
Thanks so much. Buenos días a todos y muchísimas gracias very much, Urrutia, for having received this invitation to both the government of Mexico and also the Organization of American States, and especially to the host CICTE and its executive secretary, Mrs. Treppel. It's true that my organization, which I'm leading right now, the Security Council Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate, has a very long-standing and close cooperation with CICTE, especially in our visits, our assessment visits conducted for the Security Council Counter-Terrorism Committee. We have been enjoying for years and years the support and the expertise and know-how of CICTE and its experts. This helped us certainly to have an insight in what is happening in this Western Hemisphere in terms of counterterrorism and CVE, and also it helped us to zoom in to the country's perspective, but also and especially to the regional perspective. My task today is to enlighten you on the multilateral instruments, to also have a glance on what all the efforts seen from different perspectives to address violent extremism, but also to stand still to what CTED is doing in its partnerships, and finally to have also an eye on the impact of COVID-19 on violent extremism and its countering. Let's start with those multilateral instruments, but I would like to first go into the Inter-American Convention against terrorism, which saw the daylight in 2002, which has in the meantime been ratified by 24 of the 33 countries, which initially focused very much on criminal justice and CT and countering of financing of terrorism, which also gradually started to focus on the regional cooperation and that meant to eradicate violent extremism. Moving from the regional point of view to the United Nations point of view, and very shortly stand still to what the General Assembly has been doing in relation to P and CVE, the prevention and the countering of violent extremism. Indeed, coupled to the global counterterrorism strategy with a biannual review, you see that different General Assembly resolutions saw the daylight referring to P and CVE and the enjoyment of human rights in relation to the countering of violent extremism. And also the role of the Secretary General in launching that plan of action to prevent and counter violent extremism, and in fact offering to the 193 member states around 70 recommendations in how to build up national and regional cooperation in relation to countering violent extremism with multidimensional and multi-sectorial emphasis. But let's now move to what we are doing at the Security Council, and let's move to the norm setting and the policy development at the Security Council level, especially the CTC, the Counter-Terrorism Committee. We, the Executive Directorate, are working on the policy guidance of that CTC, of the Security Council. Now, it is impressive how much Security Council resolutions saw the daylight, and they all are coupled to events, to reality situations in member states all over the globe. But the cornerstone of all these Security Council resolutions are certainly that we have to strive for a comprehensive approach, a whole of society approach, a gender sensitive and an age sensitive approach. And these are the 4 lines which currently and constantly pop up whenever we look at those Security Council resolutions. And without being complete and without taking the chance of oversimplifying, I will just overfly now over the different relevant Security Council resolutions. First and foremost, Security Council Resolution 1624. And that, in fact, saw the daylight just after 2 horrific terrorist attacks that took place, respectively, in Spain, Madrid, on the 11th of March 2004, which killed more than 190 persons at the heart of Europe, and then followed by the next year a terrorist attack in London on the 7th of July, killing more than 50 innocent people. That made the Security Council to reflect on the necessity to dig into the counter-incitement, to counter-extremism violence, and doing so in focusing on the international efforts to understand the phenomenon, and also to make sure that we all internationally got involved in a dialogue, in an engagement with the different stakeholders. And who are those stakeholders? A multitude, a myriad of stakeholders of relevance, such as the civil society organizations, media, youth, women, religious actors, also victims' rights groups, be it health caretakers, social workers, so a whole set of stakeholders which all have their role to play and do play a role in finding solutions to counter violent extremism and to react to incitement. 1624 was followed by 2878 in 2014, and that was directly linked to the flow of persons leaving different parts of the world, the so-called foreign terrorist fighters, to go to northern Syria, to Iraq, and to be, yes or no, involved directly or indirectly in terrorist activity. And then we saw that, again, this new phenomenon asked for prevention of radicalization, terrorism, and in countermeasures, which were really meant to promote political and religious tolerance, economic development, and also social cohesion and inclusiveness. And also, there the need was clearly felt to dig in more to the counter narratives to violent extremism, and also to look at rehabilitation and reintegration. We moved on. 2242, and that was where the focus started to go into the gender aspect, the role of women in the participation and the leadership of counterterrorism and CVE strategies. And we move on to 22 2250, Security Council Resolution 2250, gave an important place to youth, to young people as representatives of local, national, regional and international mechanisms and institutions. And so you see that the cornerstones are gradually being integrated in all the Security Council resolutions. Finally, we are moving to 2453, and that Security Council resolution that is focusing on counter-narrative. Counter-narrative, how to amplify positive and credible alternatives to an audience which is under the influence of violent extremism speeches. What about the countering of the misuse of ICT for terrorist and violent extremist purposes? So those were the two aspects underlined in 2354. And if you talk about counterterrorism online and you talk about the misuse of ICT, of course you obligatory have to make the link with the private sector and the so important partnership, public-private partnership, hence the importance of the GIFT-CT, which has already been referred to, the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism. And absolutely finally, we are moving to recent Security Council resolutions 2395 and 2396. The first one is in fact regulating the mandate of the organization I am heading, and 2396 is really looking with a zoom in to the returning foreign terrorist fighters. We have indeed seen that at a certain moment after the defeat of Daesh in the conflict zones, that some of those foreign terrorist fighters were relocating, turning back to different places, to their homes or to other member states. And that again was a reason to underline how important engagement with civil society was, how much we have to assist the victims of terrorism, how much we have to look at the prevention of radicalization, including in a prison setting, as prisons very often are referred to as incubators of violent extremism, again with a lot of attention to both gender and youth, and also to what to do with the returned foreign terrorist fighters in terms of rehabilitation and reintegration. And that is in fact, in a nutshell, again, I'm overflying the Security Council resolutions. If you have a genuine interest, please go and look on our website where they are well described. That is part of the DNA of my organization, to look into those Security Council resolutions, visiting, assessing the 193 countries, and not being engaged in a name and shame exercise or an advocacy exercise and saying you didn't do this, but just meant to see how strong is the security CT and CPVE chain in that respective member state, in those respective member states or in that region, and how can we step up the solidity of that security chain, and what is needed to fill that gap. So we really are there to make sure that the security CT and CPVE chain is as strong as possible. So besides the norm setting, the real vital work of the Security Council for everything that is an international threat to peace and security, we also are sharing with the member states the policy work that has been developed by the Counter-Terrorism Committee of the Security Council, to share with them guidelines, guiding principles, as we have, for instance, been doing after the adoption of 2396, where we saw that in 18 guidelines, well discussed and decided by the Security Council, we really could help to have practical solutions offered to the member states in relation to, for instance, counter-narrative, rehabilitation, reintegration, to mention a few of them. But our role is more than this. It's not only the assessments of the norm setting and to verify the implementation, because the success will depend on the implementation or the non-implementation of those Security Council resolutions, but also to see what are the lessons learned in different countries, the practices, the good practices, the effective practices in those countries, and how can we export them by coupling them to, first and foremost, to evidence-based research and to evidence-based illustrations. So it's not only our dialogue with the member states that's so important, but also to come back with practices and to verify, thanks to our partnerships, and that's, I think, a very important word in our DNA, the partnerships we have with the research community. We have indeed, since more than 5 years, established the Global Research Network, which is a network of more than 100 institutes, research centers, academia, with whom we discuss trends, developments of utmost importance seen through the eyes of today, and those lead to analytical products, to trends, reports and trends alerts. Reference was already made to our recent work in relation to the impact of COVID-19 on CVE and CT and violent extremism and terrorism. Also, a recent work was devoted on counter-narrative, on the evolution, in fact, increase of what we call, and the labeling is not that important here today, extreme right-wing terrorism. All this is the fruit of and the dialogue we have and the open sources, plus our constant consultation and cooperation with the research community. And that is leading to documents we share with the rest of the world, once we are sure that the developments, the trends are not really limited in time, but they really are something to be taken care of in the future, that we operate as a sort of an information switchboard or an early warning. But we also do, and last point, operate in the facilitation, delivery of technical assistance. So if we go to countries where we see that counter-narrative is not that well countered or set up, if we see that ICT misuse is ignored, the ICT misuse for terrorist purposes, or use of ICT for terrorist purposes is being abused, all this will be discussed with all stakeholders and the governments, which are our primary partners and counterparts, but also with all the other stakeholders, members of the whole of society approach. And there we come back with a set of practices and experiences, and I would like to bring it shortly back to two experiences I had recently by leading visits, one in Peru and then the one in the United States last year. Peru, where we visited, in fact, the LUM, and that's the place of memory and tolerance and social inclusion, where I really was struck by the beauty of this monument, but which was much more than a monument set up by the Ministry of Culture, but also making sure that what happened between 1980 and 2000 was seen as a sort of a cultural heritage, a learning process where young people could be confronted with the reality, could hear the voices, see faces of those who were victims of those atrocity, and come out of it as a stronger person. This never again, we have to avoid this in the future. And exactly the same impression I had when I visited, in the frame of the visit of the United States assessment, the memorial that was established after 9/11, much more again than a monument, not only showing the huge consequences of this catastrophe here and worldwide, but also how this led to positive collaboration, cooperation during and after the terrorist activity. And I think that when I move on to Europe and recently to South Asia, Southeast Asia rather, when you are confronted with victims and those victims tell you, we go to school, so we talk about the effects of terrorism, we are part of the prevention. We can tell young people how devastating hate extremism, violent extremism can become when it's transformed into tangible terrorist activity. Or where I saw that victims were having dialogues with terrorists, showing them how resilient and resistant they were, giving a very strong signal to the terrorist community as well. And last but not least, I would like to say some words about youth, how important youth is when you have a dialogue and engagement with the different member states. And I had the pleasure and rather the honor to meet with a lot of pleasure is a very wrong word choice here. The concern to see that youth, which is a big majority of the community, was heavily affected by terrorism, where the terrorist authorities, the terrorist organizations rather, were really closing schools, make sure that they had no hope and perspective, and making sure that they are not part of this workflow development and economy. That is something we have to take care of. If we don't do this right now, it will have a consequence. On the impact of COVID-19, we made an analytical paper very shortly. There is an impact of COVID-19. We see the increase online. It has been alluded to. I can't agree more with what has been said. But also emergency power, digital surveillance, and the launch of terrorist offenses linked to COVID-19, if not limited in time, if heavy-handed and over-securitized, might have really human rights concerns. And finally, last but not least, an impact on the stakeholders. If we don't continue to fund the stakeholders, to give civic space to civil society organizations and NGO, we might create much more problems for the future and create more grievances and hence more reasons for being confronted with radicalized and violent extremist activity. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctora Coninsx. Muy interesantes sus planteamientos y su reflexión. Muchas felicidades por su liderazgo para la adopción de la resolución 2396. Creo que en algún otro momento valdría mucho la pena especificar cuáles son los 18 lineamientos y qué aportan de nuevo para el análisis y sobre todo para la prevención y el combate de este fenómeno. Yo quisiera hacer un breve recuento sobre puntos muy importantes, fundamentales para este análisis, para esta reflexión de nuestros dos distinguidos panelistas. Poner énfasis en el tema de la tolerancia y la igualdad. No son temas menores, están en el centro de la prevención de estas realidades. La importancia desde Naciones Unidas y también desde la OEA a fortalecer la cultura de paz y los derechos humanos para todas las personas. Parece secundario desde algunas perspectivas hacer mayores esfuerzos en el tema de una nueva manera de vivir en este planeta, pero creo que dentro de las grandes enseñanzas de esta desafiante epidemia y pandemia ha sido el que tenemos que cambiar nuestra manera de vivir, nuestra manera de asumir nuestro destino y nuestra supervivencia. Y para eso quisiera recordar que la Agenda 2030 de Naciones Unidas, que hemos hecho todos los Estados miembros de esa organización, plantea exactamente uno de los retos también de esta discusión, que es una mirada holística de nuestra vida. Cómo no seguir haciendo más cosas, cómo no hacer lo mismo, cómo hacer las cosas de una manera distinta. Cómo responsabilizar a todos los actores, cómo vivir con una responsabilidad compartida nuestra estancia en este planeta. El tema del género y de la edad, muy importantes. El tema de los jóvenes, creo que debiera de llamar nuestra atención para las cosas que hacen falta hacer. Tenemos 6 convenciones en el ámbito interamericano y 3 declaraciones que tocan este tema de manera central o de manera adicional. Sin embargo, hay todavía la sensación de que falta una actualización de nuestros instrumentos globales y hemisféricos también para prevenir y combatir este fenómeno de una manera mucho más eficaz. Desde sus perspectivas, ¿están de acuerdo en este planteamiento? ¿Qué abonarían, qué comentarían sobre esto? Quizá a la doctora Coninsx en el ámbito global y al embajador Adsett en el ámbito interamericano, si son tan amables.
It's an excellent question, Ambassador. And maybe I could start with just a couple of comments, and I'm sure Michèle will continue on from the international perspective, as you said as well. The Inter-American Convention Against Terrorism, of course, provides an excellent basis for work, but I think there's a couple of issues to bear in mind with the Inter-American Convention. It was drafted back in 2002. It doesn't contemplate violent extremism in its wording. I don't think that's unique to the Inter-American Convention, and I think we're all familiar. And I'm sure Michèle will speak more about this, but we're all familiar with the challenges with the Global Convention Against Terrorism as well. But it is something perhaps to keep in mind, and it may be useful for member states or states parties to that instrument to discuss application of the convention. What's been the experience with its application, and how might it be used as a tool to address violent extremism if there's some opportunities there. The other part is that there's 24 states parties. Ideally, there would be more. 24 is a start, but I think we need to continue our efforts to encourage broader ratification. And even for those states that have ratified, to ensure that the necessary legislative steps have been taken internally to implement. Ratification is one thing, implementation is another, and that's, I think, an important ongoing focus. Perhaps with that as a start, I could turn over to Michèle for comments.
Well, very brief comments, because I can't agree more with what you just said. Globally, everything will depend on the implementation or the non-implementation. But that as such is not enough. It's not because you have a legal frame, you have everything put in place that you're an excellent student. It's also how you reach out to different stakeholders, how frequently you have dialogues and engagement with them, how you include them in your strategies and in your decision maker, or if it just is a listening ear, and then you do as a government authority whatever you intended to do. What we know, however, is that terrorists and violent extremists thrive in fragile and fragilized territories, and that is for sure the case. So if you do not take care of health and development and security and violent extremism, sooner or later terrorists are taking over. That is for sure. And hence the reason why I focus so much on youth, because terrorists focus on schools. I just recently was involved in a recent visit, in fact, in an African country where only the last months 100 attacks took place, compared to the last 4 years, the same amount of terrorist activity. So this year, also under COVID-19, a huge increase of terrorist attacks. What have we seen? 55,000 children were without education because 100 schools have been attacked. 1,000 teachers are without work. In a country heavily affected by terrorism, where education is disrupted, where economy is heavily impacted, and where on top they also have environmental and climate problems. we have to address this problem, and you might say it's not in my hemisphere, it's not in my country, so hence it's not my problem. The problem is definitely global and needs, of course, to focus on the local, the national, the regional, and the international aspects, and all are equally important. If that country is not taking seriously its national counterterrorism strategy, is not taking seriously the regional counterterrorism strategy, we miss a lot of opportunities to be effective. If it doesn't take seriously criminal justice with all the human rights compliance, gender and the age sensitivities, we have another problem on top. So yes, it is, I think, extremely important to just not say it's a not me situation, because it is a us situation. And we see exactly in COVID-19, it's exactly the same thing. If we only think that what we do in our local entities or national entities is enough, we miss an opportunity to refer to international cooperation and partnership, which is so vital here again. The same for violent extremism and terrorism. So yes, it's not only about the norm setting, the policy development, but also about looking at the good practices. What works, what doesn't work. And once we know sure to evidence base that it is an effective practice, we spread it worldwide. And we do it in close cooperation with the Global Counterterrorism Task Force. We do it with the regional and international organizations. We have a constant partnership. Partnership, I think, is a key word. Yes.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias. Yo creo que con las ponencias y con las reflexiones últimas hemos respondido también a las inquietudes de nuestro público, excepto a una de ellas, que es para el embajador Adsett, de María Eugenia. Dice, ¿cuál es el nombre de grupo de Marruecos, el que usted, embajador, citó durante su ponencia? ¿Quiere saberlo de nuevo? Escucharlo de nuevo.
It's an excellent question, and let me just pull up my notes so I give it to you exactly, precisely, but I think it's the, here we are. So with the Kingdom of Morocco, we have been co-chairing the Global Counterterrorism Forum, the Global Counterterrorism Forum. There's so many of these groups, it's easy to get the names mixed up, so that's why I had to go back to my notes. But it's a group of about 30 countries, and as I say, actually within this region, both Colombia and the United States are members of it as well. Global Counterterrorism Forum.
Muchas gracias, y con esto prácticamente hemos concluido este segundo panel. Yo aprovecharía esta oportunidad y a todos los que generosamente están conectados a este diálogo y a los gobiernos, a los estados, a decirles que hay una robusta ya marco de desarrollo interamericano que ustedes pueden consultar. Y quisiera también instar, exhortar a los estados que no han ratificado las convenciones a hacerlo en favor de su ciudadanía. En particular, dos muy jóvenes convenciones, la Convención Interamericana contra toda forma de discriminación e intolerancia y la Convención Interamericana contra el racismo, la discriminación racial y formas conexas de intolerancia. No solamente a firmarlas, sino a ratificarlas. Creo que es uno de los principales instrumentos muy efectivos que podemos hacer desde los estados para mejorar la vida de nuestra ciudadanía. Muchas gracias a nuestros distinguidos ponentes. Ha sido un honor escucharlos.
Muchísimas gracias, embajadora Baños, y igualmente agradecemos a nuestros distinguidos panelistas, el embajador Hugh Adsett, representante permanente de Canadá ante la OEA, y a Michèle Coninsx, directora ejecutiva del Comité contra el Terrorismo de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas, CTED. Antes de finalizar el evento del día de hoy, aprovecho para recordar a nuestros participantes que este webinar va a quedar grabado y estará disponible por nuestras redes sociales, que son en Twitter OEA-CICTE y en Facebook OEA-CICTE. Los invitamos también a estar atentos a próximos seminarios web que estaremos realizando en distintos temas relacionados a la lucha contra el terrorismo. Para cerrar, finalmente le doy la palabra de nuevo a Alison Treppel, secretaria ejecutiva del Comité Interamericano contra el Terrorismo, CICTE, quien nos ofrecerá unas conclusiones y palabras de clausura.
Thank you again, Andrea, participants, panelists, Undersecretary Delgado, Secretary Urrutia, Ambassadors Baños and Adsett, Michèle, Oren, Bibi. Thank you all so very, very much for your valuable contributions, thoughtful insights, your participation here today over this past 2 hours. I think everyone who is logged in and participating would agree that it's been an incredibly informative experience. There are many, many different takeaways, and I've taken arduous notes. But I think if we had to walk away today with just a couple of key ideas, we would all agree that they are these. First of all, that there is no place for hatred and intolerance in our hemisphere and in this world, and that we all together must be committed to putting it to a stop. Because the threats are real. And as our panelists have confirmed, the threats are real in this hemisphere as well. Some of our colleagues also through the global database would indicate to us that 88% of the violent extremist attacks in this hemisphere have been successful. So the threat is real, and the threat is evolving, particularly in the face of this pandemic. And so what we need to be able to address those threats effectively are coordinated, integral, multi-sectorial responses. Of course, evidence-based responses. And this will only be possible through effective cooperation and coordination at all levels: local, national, regional, and international. Both government, private sector, civil society and academia, and society alike. And clearly, as we've heard today repeatedly, from a human rights approach. As we've heard today, much good and important progress has been made, whether it's through the CICTE Declaration, through numerous international frameworks, the UN Security Council resolutions, and good and important efforts from civil society. But much work remains to be done to ensure that violent extremism, its threats and responses, figures prominently in the agendas of both government and society. This is absolutely critical. So CICTE, for its part, remains committed to helping its member states support their efforts to prevent and counter violent extremism in the hemisphere. And as was mentioned earlier today, this is the first of a series of virtual conversations that we will be having on this topic. Perhaps someday they will become face-to-face conversations, but for the foreseeable future, we will continue to connect here through Zoom and other virtual platforms to be able to dive a little deeper into some of the issues that have come up today, including recruitment and radicalization, particularly through the internet. Which CICTE completely agrees with, the very important aspects of victim attention, and then the focus on gender and youth. So this series will resume in September after a short August recess. We hope that you all will join us again for future conversations on this very important topic. With that, I'm very pleased to close this first event. Thank you again for your participation and active collaboration. Have a great day.